for all the blessings bestowed upon us so we can come here to attend today's lecture without any obstacles. Salawat and salam are always given to our Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, who has already taught us respectively to guide us in order to have happiness and also a prosperous life in the world and hereafter. Honorable Ibu Dinar Dewi Kania, the Director of the Center for Gender Studies Indonesia, our respectable speakers, Brother Muhammad Jalal from the Thinking Muslim United Kingdom, and also Sister Rahmatul Husni from the Center for Gender Studies Indonesia, our distinguished guest, and all the audiences and the participants. Welcome to the CGS International Lecture Series on Muslim Women and Globalization. We are very pleased and thank you for having us tonight to join us in this lecture despite all of your busy schedule, and I hope we can learn and also share a lot from this event. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I am Esty Imaniar, and I will be the moderator for today's international lecture. This agenda is conducted by the Center for Gender Studies Indonesia, a non-profit and non-governmental organization which is based on at Jakarta, Indonesia, and focuses on doing critical research or studies on gender and feminism from Islamic perspective. So before having the lecture, let's take a look at our short profile. This is our short profile. So the Center for Gender Studies Indonesia was established at 2012. It began with actually a blog, and then it developed to an organization nowadays. And in it, we actually coming as the critical organization, in seeing the phenomenon of feminism in Indonesia. So in addition to countering the issue, CGS is also continue to provide education for the public on Islamic worldview, as well as the concept of Muslimah and family as the proposal. And then next. This is the clusters within CGS. In order to develop our comprehensive research and education, we have 5 clusters, research clusters: the Islamic studies, philosophy, family and sexuality, social politics, and law, and the cluster of law. And then for you who never known before about us, you can follow us or read some of our writings on the website ThisisGender.com or ThisisGender.org, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel. This is quite new actually, ThisisGender.com. We also have several social media accounts like Instagram, ThisisGender, and also fans page on Facebook, ThisisGender. Go follow them, don't forget. And then next, these are some of our activities. First one is coffee, or it is an online class on feminism and Islam. We have the regular coffee, level-based classes, and also on special issues. And the other activities, we also have international lecture series like what we are having tonight, and also a community named the Kalami Veritatis, which held a book review and discussion for our internal community. And also we have collaboration with other organizations in the local, national, and also global or international scale. Okay, next. So let's just get started. Today we are having international lecture series on Muslim women and globalization. But before hearing the lecture from our speakers tonight, great speakers tonight, I wonder what comes to your mind, brother and sister, whenever you hear about the word globalization. Is it about modernization or interaction or integration? Or have you ever heard about this word global village? A global village where every of us its neighbor under under global values, global status, even finally global rules. So having a discussion about this theme tonight, we have two respectable speakers with us tonight who will deep dive into this issue. The first speaker is Sister Rahmatul Husni. She is a lecturer of English for Islamic Studies at Ibn Khaldun University Bogor and At-Taqwa College Depok. She earned her Sarjana Humaniora degree for literary studies at Andalas University and also Magister of Islamic Education and Doctor of Islamic Education at Ibn Khaldun University. Her most recent publication and research focus on gender and education. Her thesis entitled CEDAW's Concept of Gender Equality and its Impact on Women's Education in Islam was presented in Asia International Multidisciplinary Conference at UTM, Malaysia. The dissertation concerned a case study of online courses by the Center for Gender Studies, which is our organization, which is entitled The Influence of Gender Concept to Harmonization of Family. She also published some writing on journals such as Tawazun, Journal Analysis Data, Tahrir, and newspapers such as Hawan, Singgalang, Radar Bogor, and Republika. So, brother and sister, without any further ado, let's hear the discussion explanation, some insight from our first speaker, Sister Rahmatul Husni. Please, Sister Rima, that's what I called her, the Zoom room is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sister Esty. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Okay. So, alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin, nahmaduhu wa nasta'inuhu wa nastaghfiruh. ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهد الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله لا نبي بعده أما بعد. This is a nice occasion for me to meet all of you tonight, that we would like to discuss about women education in CEDAW. Yeah, on CEDAW, and in based on Islamic perspective. So thank you very much for Ibu Dinar, and all the CGS members, and of course the committee, the host who has tried to manage this discussion, the international series. So today we could talk about this discussion, the topic. Okay, so discussing about the women education, actually the word today, nowadays take put the women as the main focus. So when we talk about women education, it could not be separated by the major agenda, which is how could we say, CEDAW is like the main factor in feminism theory, or the feminism revolution and the feminism system. So it's like we talk about the policy here, the policy which is try to handle all the countries, all the states in the world. So I'd like to, could you see the slide, the PowerPoint? Okay. Here I put the introduction. There are image, which represents how the women acts yesterday, today, and in the future. Here you could see this anecdote, yeah, like women yesterday, yeah, or women in the past, like get discriminated by the male, or they said a patriarchy system, and then women today, yeah, it could be seen here that it's like they have the power to increase their volume to the husband. And then it also represents a vision of feminism, yeah, which is they like to seems, yeah, as if, yeah, as if the feminists would like to put the men under their subordination, yeah, because in this theory, yeah, women is subordinate and male is the domination, yeah, in a family, in the economic system, in the political system, and etc. So yeah, there are so many contentious issues of women related to gender equality concept, such as Miss World agenda, yeah, polygyny or polygamy, yeah, in Indonesia, and some formal laws for gender equality. Yeah, in Indonesia, uh, it is famous as RUU Kesetaraan Gender, and now famous as RUU Penghapusan Kekerasan Seksual. And then the secular feminists, we try to take the hermeneutism, yeah, the hermeneutic to analyze the literary studies, and also try to analyze the Quran using hermeneutic. And then Islamic feminist discourse, yeah, and LGBT women struggle to raise feminism using literary works and movies and etc. Okay, next. Okay, so before we talk about the women education, first of all, we should understand the definition of gender. Yeah, gender, yeah, which is including the articles on CEDAW. CEDAW is the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discriminations against women. CEDAW, Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. So the gender here, yeah, it is like a social construction about how the male or female should have the role, yeah, in public, yeah, in public, or the roles in environment. So you could see that the gender, there are so many theories about gender, like the feminine, the nurture and the nature. However, we not discuss about it right now, yeah, because it is a limited of time. Okay, next. Okay, so the conception of women education on CEDAW, the first of all, they thought that education is a right. Yeah, it is. You could see the articles on CEDAW, the articles 10 about education. Yeah, it is really close to the article 11 about employment. Yeah, so education, employment. Yeah, and then after that, the health. Okay, so it is just one article. However, we could conclude here that education, the first one, education is a right. Yeah. So based on the CEDAW's policy, women should have this right. Yeah. Women in entire world should have this right. Yeah, to pursue their achievement in education. And then the second one is about the equality in access, equality in process, and then equality in educational outcomes. I will try to explain it more to the next slide, please. Okay, this is the, okay, we have talked about the conception and definition of equality in CEDAW. So equality here means that we treat male and female students equally, of course. Yeah, so men and women should have a different, should have a same treatment. Yeah, and then sorry. Okay. Noisy. Okay, and then men and women should have equality in access, yeah, and equality of educational outcomes, and then equality of external results, and then the learning process. It should get the same treatment. So if the man would like to take like as an example, they would like to have the uniform, yeah, the uniform should be same, yeah, for men and women. And then the scholarship, yeah, the scholarship, yeah, should be same also. And then the school fee, and then the what else, and of course, yeah, educational outcomes here really close to the employment. Yeah, this is what we would like to tell, yeah, about, yeah, the critics toward the concept of women education in CEDAW. Yeah, and also we would like to talk about the impact also in Indonesia, yeah, the case, and then what is, yeah, this concept actually how this concept actually explained by Islamic perspective. Okay, next. Okay, so now please look at the comparison. Yeah, in Islam, okay, we will talk about CEDAW first. So in CEDAW, it seems that it will obscure the differences between men and women. Why? Because the conception of the gender, yeah. So men and women should have the same roles in society, and then men and women, yeah, if the men go to the public, and then women should also go to the public. Yeah, if a man get the higher education, and then women should have a higher education also. And then if the man has the higher income, and then women should have the higher income also. I mean, it's really how could we say, it is really measured by the system of economic, yeah. So education, employment, and the system of economy. So the educational outcomes, yeah, measured by economical system. That's the first thing that you should understand about the conception of women education in CEDAW. And then after that, yeah, about the education is a right, yeah. Actually, yeah, this CEDAW also obscure the status and the rights of women in Islam. Why? Because they not, how could I say, in Islam there are some status of women, like women as a daughter, and then women as a mother, as a wife, women as a sister, and women as a mother, yeah. And then women and the roles in the public, yeah, or da'wah. However, in CEDAW it seems like women should be success like a man, yeah. Should be success like a man. They should have a higher social status. So when you just be a daughter and you don't have a like a social status, it yeah, it seems like you are not a well-educated woman. Yeah, that's the differences. That's the differences. So well-educated women in on CEDAW's perception is really different with a well-educated women in Islamic perspective. And also, actually, in Islam, the education is not just a right. Yeah. Education is also an obligation. Faridatun ala kulli Muslim, wal Muslimah actually. Yeah. So keep your passion for knowledge. Yeah, and then also try to pursue the higher education. Yeah, whether is it formal or informal. Yeah, it is like an obligation in Islam actually, not just the right. Yeah, and then the third pseudo, yes, of course, influenced by the Western secular feminism, and actually the history. The history of feminism really. Yeah, we should have a different discussion about this. However, something we should know that it really try to not try to separate from the religion, of course, the value, and Western secular feminism. They seems like because their experience, yeah, their experience in the past uh, in Western history, it is like, yeah, the women under be I mean the women been underestimated, yeah, by Western people. Yeah, so that really have a different um method. Yeah. Okay, now we would like to see the Islamic perspective here. The Quran actually explicitly states that men and women are equal in the sight of Allah. That's the first thing. And the men and women are created from a single soul. Yeah, Quran Surah An-Nisa, verse 1. Yeah, or the first. And so, yeah, in the sight of Allah, in the sight of Allah, Allah, men and women are equal. However, yeah, they have a different role, yeah, in this life. And then the second one, Islam actually greatly honors women and elevate her status. Whether she is a daughter, you know, when you are a daughter and you could bring your father to the Jannah, yeah, even you just a daughter. However, there are so many hadith, yeah, that talk about when the father treat his daughter well and then try to educate them, and then Jannah is the how could we say, is the goal. So as the sister, as a wife, or as the mother, actually women doesn't need to compete with the man. Yeah. And then the third one, yeah, this conception, yeah, about men and women are based on Quran and Hadith. So we could see that CEDAW actually, yeah, CEDAW, and both Islam and CEDAW try to administer justice to the rights of women, but the origins, yeah, the philosophy, the concept, yeah, and the methods were quite different. Yeah, especially when we talk about bearing the child, yeah, feminists thought that bearing the child is about reproduction. However, in Islam, it is not just about reproduction. Yeah, you build a leader in the future when you bearing a child. So that's a really different concept. So I think that's all for tonight, because actually we would like to hear the brother Jalal's explanation also about the globalization, about women's and globalization. So I think I should end the discussion about women education right now. So thank you very much for attending the international lecture series. Now, please, the host, Esty, we would like to jump to the next agenda, inshallah. Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Okay, thank you, Sister Rima, for the great explanation on us how the concept of women education on CEDAW compared to the Islamic perspective, and some points which I taken. There are even if both proposes similar right of education for women, but there are basic different concept from CGS and CEDAW in seeing women education. There are different concept of well-educated women, or also in Islam, where we are seeing the education for women is an obligation, while in CEDAW it is seen as a mere right. So here we can see that, however, CEDAW played a great a role in how a nation crafting the rules or the policy to bring the education for women, their right, their methodology, or even their output of the education itself. And CEDAW itself, as a product of global policy, brings us, or giving us the clear visualization how globalization, despite the benefits, also give us challenges, for even also for the Muslim community. And here our second speaker, the brother Muhammad Jalal from the Thinking Muslim, will speak more, will give more explanation about how Muslim women and globalization, how we can probably adjust this global values, global policy into the Muslim or Islamic context and Islamic society. Before going to the presentation, I'd like to give you some background of Brother Muhammad Jalal. So, Brother Muhammad Jalal, as we know, he is a lecturer in London of Politics and International Relations, and aspiring to inspire and equip Muslims with the thought required to gain confidence about faith and to embrace the timeless challenges to Islam, to humanity. Brother Muhammad Jalal, or we can call him Brother Jalal, he hosts the Thinking Muslim podcast and leads a course looking at liberalism and Islam. So please welcome Brother Jalal. Before that, I'd like to give you some notes, dear brother and sisters. So during his time or his presentation, you can directly ask Brother Jalal whether to confirm your understanding about the explanation, or you have something popped out of your mind. So just type the question directly to the account of Brother Jalal. You can see it from the list of participants, so you can type it directly to him, and don't forget to mention your name, affiliation, and the question. Okay, Brother Jalal, are you ready? The room is yours.
Jazakallah khair, sister, for your very kind introduction. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. As-salatu was-salamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And I'm very happy to be presenting today at the Center for Gender Studies presentation. And I thank Sister Esty as well as Dr. Dinar for inviting me. And I've said before, but the Center for Gender Studies in Indonesia is doing some very important work, I think, and very crucial work in in trying to recalibrate, trying to reform the way Muslims think, especially about some of these social matters, which unfortunately for some time they have been left unchallenged in the Muslim community. So alhamdulillah, I'm very impressed with the work you're doing. And if any of our viewers today are unaware of the work of the Center for Gender Studies, I would ask you to go to their website because there are some very informative articles. And it seems to me that Indonesia, like many Muslim countries, unfortunately today, Indonesia is facing what maybe one can describe as a cultural onslaught, as an avalanche of cultural misinformation or cultural ideas which are severely challenging for Muslim identity. So alhamdulillah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you, brothers and sisters, for your efforts there. And I wish and I pray that these efforts only intensify and strengthen in the months and years to come, inshallah ta'ala. Now, as Sister Esty said, and I've been asked to come along today to discuss Muslim women and globalization. Now, I must confess at the very beginning, I'm better and more comfortable in explaining globalization because I do that as part of my teaching. Than explaining the implications on Muslim women. Inshallah ta'ala, I will try to do so. And I would imagine some of the brothers and sisters who are joining us today, especially those from the Center for Gender Studies, will be able to give many more very good examples and many important case studies to explain the impact globalization is having upon the Muslim woman and her sense of self and her sense of identity. So as the Sister Esty said, I very much appreciate if you would like to raise any questions at any time during today's presentation. You're welcome to raise those questions. You can send your questions to the moderators, or you can send those questions to me, and I will endeavor, inshallah ta'ala, to answer those questions or your comments. If you want to supplement any of what I say with a comment or an example from your own experience or from your own studies, then I would very much welcome that. So please do not feel inhibited from doing that, inshallah. Okay. So let me say a few words about myself. So the sister has talked about my background, and but I would like to focus more on the podcasts we do in the Thinking Muslim. So part of our organization, it's a very modest organization. We regularly interview people of knowledge, whether in terms of Islamic knowledge or general political and contemporary knowledge, and we try through our podcast to really reach an in-depth understanding of a topic. So, for example, if any of you have heard of Brother Hamza Zortes, who is a very prominent speaker here in the UK. I interviewed him for the last podcast on freedom of speech, and I would advise if anyone wants to take a deep dive into the topic of freedom of speech and how it contradicts and links with a liberal mindset, I would advise you to refer back to that podcast, and you can follow the link here, and you can also view that. Also, I would like to say that I've just begun a newsletter. So some sisters and brothers from previous courses that we've held have asked for a regular update on news and on contemporary events. So inshallah ta'ala, I'm planning to produce a weekly newsletter just to give an update of events and also when I give the occasional lecture, I will put up the slides on that resource. So you're most welcome to join that newsletter. Just go to Substack, Jalalain.substack.com, and you can subscribe to that weekly update, which I will send out, and it goes direct to your email addresses. So you're welcome to sign up to that, and I will give you the address at the very end as well. So Khair, let's make a start. So let's talk about globalization as a phenomenon, because I think a lot of us think we understand globalization, because of course it's around us. We talk about globalization every day. We are in a globalized world. Many of us regard ourselves to be global citizens. Just the other day, I asked my students, in fact, about their identity. So these are British students who live in a multicultural city like London. So of course, students from many backgrounds whose parents may have come to the UK. And I asked them a simple question: who do you most identify with? How do you define your identity? We were discussing globalization, and I was extremely surprised at their answers. Maybe I shouldn't have been surprised. Very few of them saw themselves as uniquely British. But if you were to dig deeper, many of them found they found close association with Japanese culture, for example, or with South Korean culture. So today, maybe 10 years ago, South Korean culture was not prominent in young people, but today, many of them are very well associated, and they associate with South Korean culture very strongly, and that's probably because of the type of cultural assets that South Korea, K-pop and various other music and film industry that these young people they soak up, they watch on a daily basis, right? So we are a product of globalization. And actually, many of you who are today viewing this presentation, I would imagine that a lot of you have not really lived in a world which wasn't associated with globalization. Certainly, if you were born after the 1980s, or during or after the 1980s, globalization just became a common term that you would very strongly associate with. And more often than not, you associate very positive connections to globalization, right? Now, it's probably worth saying, unfortunately, I suffer from being sometimes quite English in my sensitivities, and I can't help it. I would claim not to be, but when I travel around the world, one of the big problems I have is when I want to buy a cup of tea, I want to have milk in my tea. And many countries around the world do not serve milk in tea, right? And so I would seek out a brand, seek out a coffee shop or a tea shop, which I know will give me milk in my tea, right? Now, where does that come from? Where does that what's happening there? That is that ability for me to get something that I can only get at home, probably, all around the world, is a facet or an outcome of a globalized world, and we see that everywhere. I was in Indonesia maybe 10 years ago, and all of the global brands, of course, are in Jakarta. If you go to Beijing, you will find the same. If you go to Turkey, you will find the same. In Istanbul, you would find the same. The world is becoming a global village, and we hear these phrases all the time. So globalization is often used to describe many things. When we access information on the internet, we see this to be part of globalization. When we order a product that has been made halfway around the world, we say this is a result of a globalized world. That's partly because global shipping has become so cheap. We can purchase a product which was made in Indonesia, or made in Vietnam, or made in South Korea, and the majority of the makeup of the final price of that product would not have come from the shipping. By the way, it would not even have come from the labor cost of that product. The labor cost would have been very cheap. The shipping cost would have been very cheap. That product, the majority of its value would have been beyond the labor cost and beyond the cost of distribution, and that's because we live in a globalized world. When we watch a lecture, For example, today I'm here in the UK and you're there in Indonesia, or most of you are in Indonesia. And, you know, technology has allowed us to communicate like never before. 30, 40 years ago, to make a telephone call to Indonesia would be beyond a salary of a modest lecturer like me. Today, I can just go on to Skype or Zoom and make a free telephone call to you in Indonesia, and you can do the same to me in the UK. That is undoubtedly a product of globalization. Young people around the world today have developed cultural tastes, again through ways by which, through technological channels like YouTube and Netflix, where they no longer associate with their local cultures, right? They no longer associate with the culture in London or the culture in Jakarta, but also they associate, if not predominantly, they associate with cultures from around the world, typically American cultures, and we see that all the time. When we eat at a local McDonald's or a KFC or a Starbucks, we are observing this phenomenon. The Economist summed it up when it said, more or less, globalization is more or less the simultaneous marketing and sale of identical goods and services around the world. Globalization has just become a course of life. And with everything that's just become a course of life, we forget to critically understand it as an idea. We forget to evaluate it. We forget to try to understand it from its first principles, so that we can appreciate whether it's in net a good thing for us or whether in net it's a bad thing for us. As I said, those born over the last 30 years would know no better, right? The internet gives us the world. Cheap air travel allows us to experience the world. In fact, it was the flow of people and goods that allowed the coronavirus to spread around the world, right? How could it be that the coronavirus, which was first found in Wuhan, how could it be that the coronavirus within a month became a global virus? Because of globalization. So globalization, of course, is the free flow of people, goods and services around the world. And that has inevitably led to net positives and negatives as well. And again, I'm going to discuss some of these as we go along. So as I said, most of this sounds very positive. Yet, as I said, we need to appreciate and comprehend the impact it has on our lives. Now, today I'm going to focus on globalization in three senses. So as I said, it's a process by which the world becomes more interconnected, right? This is an idea that Kehoe and Joseph Nye talked about, the complex interdependence of the world. Globalization can be seen in three facets, in three aspects: cultural, political, and economic. You and I face the cultural impact of globalization on a day-to-day basis. We are in many ways a product of cultural globalization. But sometimes we forget why economic and political globalization, why that is so essential in understanding the impact globalization is having on, say, a country like Indonesia. And today I would like to spend some time discussing the economic, political, as well as the cultural aspects of globalization. It's what Thomas Friedman talked about back in the 90s when he said the world is flat. He meant by that the world today is no longer far away. Time and place has now been compressed. However, it would be wrong to believe that globalization is just something that naturally occurred. I don't know, in the 1980s and 90s, we just had a natural development of globalization. Globalization isn't natural. Globalization is a product of a policy, okay? And that's really important. It is a policy agenda. It was deliberately, it was developed through a deliberate set of policies that America, towards the end of the Cold War, developed or put together. It is part of what we understand to be the liberal world order. It is, in other words, an ideological project deliberately designed to create an American-led world through the promotion of ideas and cultures and economic systems and institutions to make the world in America's image, to make the world in a very Western image, right? And that is really the take-home message today. When you think about globalization, even though it has its benefits, you have to be well aware that it's not just a natural phenomenon. It was carefully designed as an idea to create an American-led order in the world. It is in fact what we call a liberalizing project in both in economics, in politics, but also in culture. It is a process to liberalize economics, politics, and culture. And to understand it, we have to go back. So I'm going to talk about what globalization is today. And I would say this is probably quite an important way, or quite a good way to conceptualize it, right? Liberalism is the basic way of thinking. It's the basic ideology in the West. The US-led liberal order saw it as one of its duties to spread liberalism around the world. And globalization became the carrier to spread liberalism and US power around the world. Globalization, in other words, sits on top of these two important policy goals: the need to universalize liberalism, the need to spread liberalism in economic, political, and cultural ways. But also, its globalization consolidates the US-led liberal order. It places America at the center of this order. So globalization achieves two policy objectives: firstly, to spread liberalism, and secondly, to consolidate America's liberal order. And then at the end of today's session, I'm going to give my thoughts on the impact globalization has had on the Muslim mindset, and the impact it's had on Muslim women, with all the caveats I said at the beginning that I'm not a specialist when it comes to the impact on Muslim women, but I'll give you some of my thoughts about that. Now, we have to start with Francis Fukuyama. And I think a lot of you who study politics or international relations or philosophy would have come across Francis Fukuyama, because he has now become he is a name that has become a household name in political circles. Back in 1989, Francis Fukuyama, he was a little-known academic in America, and he wrote an article in the Foreign Affairs magazine which he called The End of History. And he said the following: what we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. Now, this may sound a little complex, but in essence, what he's saying here is, after the Cold War, do you remember the Cold War was a battle between Russia, a communist Russia, and of course a capitalist America, a liberal, democratic capitalist America, or capitalist West. And he argued what we're witnessing is the end of the Cold War, but not just the end of the Cold War. We're witnessing the success of one ideology, but not only the success of one ideology, Western liberal democracy and capitalism. We're witnessing the universalization of this ideology. In other words, what he foresaw, what he predicted, was that the world now would become one. The world would adopt Western liberal democracy and capitalism because these are universal human ideals, right? This is his claim, by the way. These are universal human ideals. The world will become one and embrace this ideology. Globalization was the policy outcome of Fukuyama's prediction, or Fukuyama's understanding of universalism. Globalization was the way by which the world will move in this universalization of Western liberal democracy and capitalism. And he had a lot to talk about, of course. This was the scene outside the first McDonald's that opened in Pushkin Square in Moscow. Now, of course, those of you who've studied history, you would know that this was an extraordinary sight. Because, of course, it wasn't just McDonald's, right? It wasn't just a fast food firm that opened up in Moscow. I mean, by the way, the queues ran all around the corners. You know, it took around 2 or 3 hours just to get your Big Mac and fries from McDonald's. This was not just another fast food restaurant that opened or a fast food restaurant that opened. McDonald's represented an ideology. It represented a country, but it also represented a cultural ideal. If these people, in other words, were to succeed in this world, they would have to embrace this new ideology. They would have to embrace capitalism, and they would have to embrace the ideals, the cultural values of liberalism. Right, and so McDonald's, it was a symbol of something greater, right? It was a symbol of the universalization of Western liberal democracy and capitalism, and that is why Thomas Friedman wrote in the New York Times at that time, after he witnessed the celebration of the McDonald's that opened up in Pushkin Square. The columnist Thomas Friedman talked about the golden arches theory of global peace. He argued that any country that has a McDonald's in it, any two countries that have a McDonald's in it, will never go to war with one another. Because young men, he argued, will not want to queue up any longer to join an army. Young men would like to queue up to have a Big Mac and fries, right? And that became the common understanding of ordinary people around the world. And you in Indonesia, as well as around the world, you know, if you come from the so-called developing world, you will know that even leaders in Muslim countries, they saw that there was just no option but to embrace this new order. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I'm going to say that as I said, at the end of the Cold War, this new ideology became the dominant theme in the world. It is what John Eikenberry calls America became the liberal Leviathan. America was going to organize this new world. If you want to read a good book about liberalism, from an idealistic perspective, it's completely ridiculous, by the way. But if you want to read a good book, you want to read The Liberal Leviathan by John Eikenberry, because I think, you know, he still remains one of these idealists, believes in this idealism, this idealist who believes that sooner or later liberalism is going to become the world religion, the world ideology. Even Russia, by the way, which was a centralized communist economy, was now turning to capitalism. The liberal world order would safeguard universal ideas of liberalism, democracy, freedom, free markets, free market economics, capitalism, and cultural liberalism. It is what Clinton believed, put it as the fundamentals, President Clinton put it as a fundamental of his foreign policy. It became known as the Clinton Doctrine. The idea that if you spread capitalism, you are going to spread political and cultural values of America. Capitalism is the first thing you embrace before you embrace the political and the cultural values of America. And it became known as the Clinton Doctrine. This is why, by the way, as a quick aside, President Clinton, he was very enthusiastic about China joining the World Trade Organization, because he said he believed that when China joins the World Trade Organization, it would become more capitalist. And because it becomes more capitalist, it would embrace political and cultural norms that come from liberalism. Today, by the way, that's now seen to be a very idealistic endeavor. In fact, most people now believe that was a ridiculous idea, right? But at the time, they believed it. If Indonesia joins the capitalist club, Indonesia would then become culturally and politically, its identity will be very similar to that of the Americans, and its aspirations will be similar. But at the same time, then, whereas Indonesia embraces capitalism, it's going to become a consumer, and its men and women will purchase American products and American goods in order to fulfill their consumerist lifestyles. As the previous speaker talked about, Dr. Rahmatul, there is the changing of the mindset of Muslim women has come out of this political context of globalization. It's not just Muslim women, Muslim men, Muslim children. There is a hegemonic cultural order that is developed. And until we understand this order, we are not going to be able to find ways to combat it and to critique it and find ways to undermine it in our household and in our communities and society. Now, Muslim women became a front line in this cause, because if you change Muslim women, you change the symbol of the society. Muslim women are the prominent symbols of Muslim societies. And so if you change the attitudes, the ideals, the ideas, the economic lifestyle, the cultural norms of a Muslim woman, you are actually changing society. You're changing, you're reorienting society. And so Muslim women became a frontline cause in this project of globalization. But it's a very old project, by the way. It doesn't just it didn't just begin in the 1990s, and this project actually is a very age-old project, which came during the period of colonialism. The liberation of Muslim women has never been on the agenda of has never been on the agenda of colonial powers. As one 19th century French official put it, if we are to strike against Algerian society's capacity to resist, then we must first of all conquer their women, right? If we're going to conquer and colonize Muslim countries, we need to first colonize Muslim women. I would say to you that hasn't changed. Colonialism today isn't physical colonialism. It's colonialism in the form of brands and corporations. It's colonialism in the form of the IMF and the World Bank. This colonialism strikes at Muslim family and Muslim community and Muslim society in particular, because these are the symbols of resistance. And if you are to eradicate those symbols of resistance, you are then able to reorient those societies. And I'll talk a bit about that at the end. We have to go and find these women under the veils they hide behind, was what this academic talked about, what his French official talked about. And there's a history of colonialism. In fact, you can read a lot more about this in the book by Lila Abu Lagoud, Do Muslim Women Need Saving? But I'll move on. In fact, there was a British Consular General, Lord Cromer, who wrote that his duty in Egypt, who was a Consular General in Egypt, his duty was to change the inferior mind of the Oriental. And what did he mean by the inferior mind of the Oriental? He meant that we need to change the way they view society, their cultural attitudes. He, in particular, said that the so-called degradation of women that came from Islam, what did he mean by the degradation of women? The veiling of women, the fact that women had to dress in a particular way. He saw that as a fatal obstacle to Egypt's attainment of that elevation of thought and character, which should accompany the introduction of Western civilization. Just think about this. He observes that these countries are inferior. They need to be brought to a standard where they can embrace the character that accompanies the introduction of Western civilization. He wanted to civilize, so-called civilize Muslim women in Egypt. And again, do you see this colonial project sees very obviously that Muslim women are at the front line of this need to colonize the Muslim world, right? Hypocritically, Lord Cromer was against women's votes back home. So I teach a little bit of early 20th century British history. Lord Cromer was against the suffrage movement in Britain. And so at home, he was against women's votes. But in Egypt, he was commissioning people like Qasim Amin. He was commissioning academics to write books about the emancipation of women. They were obsessed with women. And I would say today, they continue to be obsessed with women. So I'm going to quickly talk about globalization from its economic, political, but most importantly, its cultural aspects. And then we're going to, inshallah, talk about the implication upon the Muslim world. Now, globalization is primarily, or at least one of its strongest aspects, is its economic aspects. But also it has a political aspect. And I'm going to focus a little bit on the IMF and the World Bank and the impact of the IMF and the World Bank upon the Muslim world. And then, inshallah, we're going to talk about the cultural aspect of globalization, the spread of Americanization, the spread of liberal norms. Okay, so let's talk about economic liberalization. So economic liberalization really means the opening up of economies to free trade, and it's an idea to erode protectionism, or to remove protectionism within a state. The American objective, or the objective of European and Western states and organizations like the IMF and World Bank, is to create a world that is interdependent and to create a free trading world. Many countries nowadays, particularly those in the developing world, see it as no other choice but to liberalize their economies. They see that liberalizing their economies is a sure route to attracting money and capital from abroad, but also to attract multinational companies like Apple and like H&M and various other global corporations. It's what in academia they call the Tina factor. There is no alternative. India had to open up to economic reforms. Indonesia had to open up to economic reforms back in the 1960s and 70s. And so by opening up your economies, you become you are able to access money and capital, which supposedly helps your economies grow and builds your economy to be plugged into this global economy, global trading system. Indonesia, for example, is a member of ASEAN, and ASEAN recently signed a trade agreement called the RCEP, with Japan, South Korea, Australia, China, which has now allowed Indonesia to be part of this very big free trade organization. In fact, it's worth a third of global trade now, and it's a very big organization, right? I would say to you that very few Indonesian academics, no, that's wrong to say actually, I would imagine very few mainstream Indonesian academics are critically analyzing whether this is actually going to be good for Indonesia. Is this going to help ordinary Indonesians, or is there going to be a negative impact upon Indonesian society? And if you want in the Q&A, we can maybe talk about this. What's the problem with economic globalization? Economic globalization makes you dependent on outside trade. So, for example, Indonesia is dependent on trade with Western economies, but today, more so China. And so when China slows down, the Indonesian economy slows down. So when China, a few years ago, no longer were importing raw materials and minerals which Indonesia provides at the speed at which it needed it, Indonesia's economy slowed down. It leads to lots of low-skilled jobs, and by the way, lots of women who are encouraged to enter the workplace. Those women end up working in those low-skilled jobs. I mean, the reason why the West are so interested in emancipating the women is partly because it then produces more you produce more laborers to work in your sweatshops, to work in low-skilled jobs, because that is what Indonesia has now become in Vietnam, and these economies have now become popular for. They are low-skilled, have large workforce which have low skills. Many of those low-skilled workers are women, right? And men, and you now need, as you know full well in Indonesia, you now need both couples to be working just in order to make ends meet. And even then, they can't ordinarily make ends meet. It also has created a deindustrialization of a country. As your, as your economy becomes very one-dimensional, your economy deindustrializes. Your economy is dependent on the export of mineral products abroad, oil and mineral products abroad, right? This is what we see all across Africa. Africa remains deindustrialized because Western corporations have in effect used and abused Africa for its mineral resources, and there is a one-way traffic here. The money escapes those countries, and minerals escape those countries at a very parlous price, a very cheap price. So just think about Zambia, which is one of the world's greatest exporters of copper. Yet the Zambian government receive very little taxation from companies like Glencore, who raid the Zambian economy for its resources, and provide very little skilled labor, because it doesn't need skilled labor, because of course a lot of what is required to make those goods, to benefit from copper, happens outside Zambia. It leads to inequality. Just think about the financial crisis that hit Indonesia, the East Asian financial crisis in '97. It harmed the Indonesian economy, not because of any fault of anyone in Indonesia, but because Indonesia was so connected with the global economy. When the Eastern countries were hit, and it was a financial crisis, by the way, which started in countries like Malaysia and Singapore, that had an impact on Indonesia. There's a very good report written by an Indonesian, Jafri Sarin, who writes, for the last 3 decades, an important social transition has taken place in Indonesia. It has brought with it a cultural changes, as well as emergence of narabas, I'm sure I pronounced that wrong, trespassing, mentality, and tegal, heartless behavior. These phenomena are related to the emergence of consumer culture, in which people are misguided with the belief that the image of things consumed are highly cultural activities. Such consumer culture is strengthened by the market expansion of industrial products from advanced countries carried out by the process of globalization. I would advise you to read this paper. It's a really good critique of how globalization is superficializing Indonesian society. It's making ordinary people into just mindless consumers. I see that all the time here in Western societies. Young people have just become mindless consumers. Because that's what their worth is, and that's where they see value, and again, that value is always can never be reached, right? Because of course consumerism is just, if rabid consumerism is a superficial activity, and it superficializes the individual, and it builds no happiness within the individual. And many young Muslim girls are impacted by this type of society. But also you see a more insidious aspect of economic globalization, the commodification of women's dress, the headscarf industry. The brand specialists have argued, the American headscarf design contest, in research that it conducted, argued that there is a $96 billion female Muslim fashion market that is untapped. The commodification of symbols of Muslims, or symbols of Islam, is the byproduct of this economic globalization. World-renowned fashion brands are aware of Muslim women's purchasing power and their need for clothing or certain types of clothing. In recent years, there are clothing stores whose mannequins wear headscarves, combined with suitable dress, even in non-Muslim countries. Brands like Zara, H&M, Forever 21, the luxury chains like Bergdorf Goodman, Macy's, Nordstrom, and Barney's in New York all now host products specifically for Muslim women to attract both conservative customers who wear the headscarf and those who are looking for something different than classical fashion trends that commoditize women's bodies. Various fashion designers create new collections inspired from Islamic clothing, even the burqa. Now, inspired is a very important term here, because of course, if you stick to the Shari'i requirements of the hijab, you're not going to be able to produce multiple products, right? And so what these fashion brands do is they are inspired by hijab, but they create new types of hijab. And you know, my sisters would talk about this, that on the streets of Jakarta, on the streets of Karachi, on the streets of London or New York, you're now seeing Islamic, so-called Islamic dress inspired by these brands, which actually contradict the very basic essence of what Islam is, right? And what Islam sought to achieve from hijab and from the khimar. And so we end up having a type of dress which contradicts the ethos, because you've taken away the value system that undergirds what hijab is about. It's like yoga. It's like meditation, right? You go on the internet today and you hear about meditation. Well, meditation comes from Buddhism or something like that, or mindfulness comes from Buddhism. But of course, for Western brands to exploit and to commercialize and to commodify these things, they strip it away from its from the difficult stuff, right? The haya, the modesty that comes from hijab, because that's difficult, and in fact that doesn't sell products, and they rebrand it to reflect a liberal mindset, to reflect the cultural values and the cultural norms that come from liberalism, right? Even Victoria Beckham, one of the one of the names in branding, has created what she calls the stunning bonnets, right, in a 2011 winter collection, which basically was marketed at Muslim women, but reflects a Victorian English style, right? And this comes from the incessant need of Western brands to commercialize everything and anything, and that's what we see on the streets of many Muslim capitals today. Let me say a few words about the IMF, because I think the IMF is really important, but I know that I have not very much time left. See, the IMF is an important institution to carry this economic liberalism, but also to change the attitudes and change the understanding of Muslim men and women around the world, and everyone else around the world, right? If you don't know very much about the IMF, its responsibility is to bail out economies, and with its twin organization, the World Bank, it is there really to develop countries, and to so-called developed countries, and to move them forward and to turn them into Western-style economies. The IMF bases a lot of its principles on Rostow's concept of development, right? And Rostow argues that development, the end point of development, if you would, he draws out a pyramid. The end point of development is hyper-commercialism, hyper-consumerism. Because when you've got a hyper-consumerist society, you're creating incessant demands for more products, and that then feeds your economy. So the more consumerism you have, the more your economy is going to be fed, right? And so the IMF and the World Bank try to develop these consumerist societies by reconstructing societies and countries on the basis of what they call the Washington Consensus. And the Washington Consensus is basically capitalism, right? It is a shorthand for capitalism. Countries who take loans from the IMF, like Indonesia, that took loans in the 1960s and 70s, and still do today, by the way, those countries have to cut public spending. What do we mean by cutting public spending? Cutting spending to education, cutting spending to healthcare, reform the tax system so that companies and corporations are favored in the tax system. They deregulate their financial markets. In other words, they allow Western banks to capitalize or to use their to dominate the capital marketplace in these countries. The Washington consensus is, it believes in free trade and direct investment and privatization. The World Bank and the IMF have systematically made loans to states as a means to influence their policies. Foreign indebtedness is a means by which you can subordinate countries. You can turn countries that have got assets, countries that have got a large workforce. You can create those, make those countries into subordinates, into satellite states, into countries that no longer have economic and political sovereignty. And this is a way by which the West influences those countries. And just think about the IMF and the World Bank in Indonesia. I'm no expert in Indonesia, but I often use Indonesia as a case study. There's a journalist here called John Pilger, who talks a lot about the actions of the IMF in Indonesia. And I'm going to talk about how Muslim women are impacted by this in a second, inshallah. When during the Cold War, President Sukarno sought technical assistance from Russia, the IMF offered loans to Indonesia. But Sukarno started to nationalize all foreign private companies, except for oil companies, of course. And as a result of that program of nationalization, there was a coup, and by the way, he decided to leave the IMF and the World Bank. There was a coup later on in that year, and Suharto, as you know, became the military president dictator of the country, supported by America. Suharto rejoined the IMF and the World Bank, and America, the money started to flow in. That allowed America to control Indonesia. It led to a dependence based on the conditions that these institutions set upon these countries, until these countries lost control over their economic management. And Indonesia is a good case study of that, right? Southeast Asia's crisis of 1997 dealt a hard blow to Indonesia. In a space of less than a year, foreign capital was withdrawn from the country. Mass unemployment happened in 97. And by 1998, 50% of the population lived under the poverty line. What did the IMF do as a result of the Southeast Asian financial crisis? It instilled what Naomi Klein calls shock treatment. It asked the Indonesian government, in exchange for money, it asks, in exchange for loans, it asked the Indonesian government to cut public spending even further, to hospitals, to schools, to welfare payments, right, and to create a free market economy, so that supposedly Indonesia will be able to grow out of the crisis. And as you know, in the 1990s, late 1990s, there were riots in Indonesia as a result of this. And today, Indonesia, the largest portion of the state's budget is devoted to repayments of this debt. And the debt it's repaying, by the way, is debt, interest-paid debt that came sometimes from the 1970s and 80s and the 90s. This debt never ends, right? But because this debt never ends, countries are forever indebted, and countries lose the levers, the economic levers, by which you can control and you can run your economies. Capitalism destroys those economies. If you want to read a good book, on capitalism, you need to read Ha-Joon Chang. Sorry, I should have brought, it's the whole thing will fall apart. 23 Things You Need to Know About Capitalism by Ha-Joon Chang. It's a very good book because it talks about how there is a hypocrisy in the way the West views capitalism. The West says through the IMF that you are not allowed to subsidize your economies, right? Governments are not allowed to subsidize companies in their economies. Yet the West subsidize their economies all the time. The EU, for example, 40% of the EU budget goes into agricultural subsidies. The Americans subsidize their steel and their agricultural sector. If Indonesia wanted to have a subsidy for any of its economies, it will be breaking IMF conditions. There is an asymmetric relationship, and that impacts people in these countries. Now, I can't show you this, but it's a small clip. Inshallah, I will post it to the moderators, and they will inshallah send it to you. But it talks about Jamaica and how Jamaica was worse off as a result of it. Now, what is the impact of that? The impact of economic globalization is a flight of minds, a flight of intelligent people. You see it in Indonesia, you see it in Pakistan. People who gain an education leave these countries in order to join Western economies, because the brain drain, because this brain drain is caused by the lack of jobs for semi-skilled or highly skilled people in those economies. And so you have a cycle of decline in these countries like Indonesia, and that cycle of decline leads to stagnation, and it doesn't lead to progress, right? Now let's move on to cultural globalization because of time. Economic and political globalization. So economic, I mean free markets and capitalism. Political globalization, I mean IMF and the World Bank and organizations like that. These two sets of globalizations conspire to create a Western brand. By culture, we mean history, traditions, language, habits, pastimes, food, and any other activity that's peculiar to a state. What we see today is not only that, but Western traditions and languages and pastimes, but also ideas and ideas like human rights and democracy and freedom. These things have exported or are exported to the world until you see the Americanization or the Westernization of the world. So, for example, the cultural assets of a country, especially the strong countries in the world, are exported around the world. You see that with the Premier League. You see that with the monarchy. I'm sure all of you know about Harry's plight in America. Poor Harry. He's had to move to America today because Prince Harry has fallen out with the royal family. Why do you know that? That's a question I want to ask you. Why do you care about Prince Harry? Because Prince Harry sometimes means more to you, more to us, than someone who lives in our own country, right? Why do we care about Diana so much? Just think about that. Why do we care about Diana? Who is Diana, right? Why do we care about her? Because she's become part of our culture, right? Because of The Crown, a Netflix series which talks about the royal family, right? Why do we concern ourselves with the dramas in these countries? Well, we concern ourselves with the dramas in these countries because, of course, the dramas in these countries have now become our cultural lingua franca, our cultural consumption, right? Doctor Who, Sherlock, Burke and Locke, these philosophers, these are the cultural wealths of Britain. It's what we call the flattening out of the world, where different cultures embrace this world culture. What I mean by world culture is an American or a Western culture. This means that unlike previous centuries, cultures are now consumed beyond national borders. It is what the Indian physicist Vandana Shiva calls the monocultural culture of the mind, dominated by US and Western values and lifestyles, driven by a consumer-based free market ideology, and carried through the massive US entertainment industrial complex. The global monoculture has infiltrated every corner of every corner of the earth. And this is what shapes the middle classes across the world. And those middle classes want to consume more. There is a cycle. Your consumption, your culture, your cultural attitudes has a direct link with your consumption. Because the more you associate with a country, the more you want to purchase from a country, right? And so the emerging economies like Indonesia and Brazil, like Indonesia and Turkey, they clamor to watch programs that come from these countries, and they provide a roadmap for the affluent lifestyles. A young person in Jakarta is thinking about the young person in America, and he's charting, or she's charting, a roadmap for success, right? So the cultural colonialism has got to such a degree that we no longer associate with our own countrymen and women. We actually believe that they're regressive. How many times do you see this? You speak to a young girl in Indonesia, and she sees people, young women in Indonesia, to be regressive, to be backwards, right? If only they could be like the girls in those emancipated dramas they shown on Netflix, right? This Is Us, or the high school dramas, right? Or the films that talk about, if only they could be like them, courageous individual girls who've got an individual spirit, who are emancipated. Where does that come from? Where does that type, and with it immodesty and the lack of haya, the lack of modesty that comes from the tradition, where does that come from? It comes from a consumption this consumption of culture is there to sell brands. It's there to sell you a lifestyle, so you purchase more from these Western countries, right? And I've got some stats in. I don't need to go through all these stats, but Netflix is a good example of that. Netflix has now over 250 million subscribers. It's probably watched by over 350 million people around the world. Netflix is a carrier of this cultural colonialism, right? With these cultural assets comes westernization, comes ideals, liberal democratic ideals, capitalist ideals, and the byproducts of this liberalism. I mean, I run a course on liberalism, and I talk about how Western culture is not benign. It's not this neutral thing. Whenever we watch a television series, we've been indoctrinated. It's da'wah, right? When we talk about da'wah in an Islamic sense, it's the propagation of ideas, right? Well, the propagation of ideas today is through our TV sets and through our phones and through our computer screens. This is da'wah. Freedom and individualism comes out of this. Why is it that young girls and young boys in Jakarta today are individualistic like never before, like that academic said? Because there is a tight connection between economic, political, and cultural globalization. These things come together, and through it, you adopt the moral values, the ideals, the ideas that come from these countries, right? You no longer need to invade countries, in other words. There is no need to send in tanks to change people today, but rather you send in Netflix, you send in the BBC. This is what you send in. You send in Hollywood in order to change mindsets, right? It is what we call the McDonaldization of society. You're selling a lifestyle. You're selling a way of thinking more than just, an empty soap opera or whatever it may be. You're selling liberal values so that people are more susceptible to that. And this is my final slide. It's what creates a clash of values. Across the Muslim world today, we're seeing a clash of values. Cultural globalization has led to this clash of values. Young people, and it's particularly acute with young people today, confront a value system that challenges their Islamic values. Young women are sold a version of beauty and marriage and lifestyle and morality and attitudes that changes their sense of self. It changes who they believe they are today, right? Because if your consumption is a lifestyle that is a foreign lifestyle, and then you read a hadith and you read Quran, you get this contradiction, this paradox, right? The Quran and the tradition is saying one thing, and the cultural input is saying another. But if your constant cultural input is that, who is going to win? Do you see? Who is going to win in this battle of ideas if you're being groomed by this cultural onslaught, by this cultural globalization? So the carriers like Netflix and the music scene and Hollywood and these various other forms of popular culture, they impact upon us. Now, don't think this is benign. There are books written about this in international relations. I would ask you to pick up the book by Joseph Nye, who talks about the meaning of power. I mean, the book is called The Meaning of Power, in fact, where he says that America's biggest asset is soft power. The way, in other words, to change the world and to make them more favorable towards you is to change the way they think, to change their attitudes, to change their tastes, to change the ways by which they soak up, they evaluate, they embrace culture, right? And so what we find is this constant contradictions in our countries. These contradictions come from the cultural input. When a Muslim parent is wondering, and we all face it, by the way, I'm not in any way immune from this. When a Muslim parent sees their daughter or their son is becoming more westernized, well, where do you think that comes from? You know, does it just come naturally? Is this some sort of natural process? What I mean by westernized, I mean they adopt positions that contradict Islam, right? They adopt positions which break down the concept of what it is to be a Muslim. Where does that come from? That, of course, comes from a cultural globalization. And where does that lead them? That leads them then to emulate those lifestyles. And to emulate those lifestyles, you've got to buy the products to emulate those lifestyles, right? So the link is very, very clear. This is why feminism, which I know the Center for Gender Studies talks a lot about, this is why feminism has become so popular amongst young Muslim women. Not because Muslim women have thought about it, but because it's just a cultural input. Every film, every program they see it has the same thing, right? It gives the same narrative. It shows a young woman trying to free herself from the shackles of her father, right? And from her cultural family. And so the mindset is, we need to do the same. We need to free ourselves. We need to emancipate ourselves from this, right? This is why this is the relationship, as I said, between cultural and economic globalization. So in summary, what's happening here is globalization has created a world where through economic globalization, through political organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, and through cultural globalization, these things are coming together, they're conspiring together to change us. And the challenge for us as Muslims is we need to find a counter narrative to this liberalization. Not, by the way, and I'm going to leave it at this note, and maybe we talk about it in Q&A, not a counter narrative which goes the other way. We've done this for centuries, right? We embrace a strict orthodoxy, a strict conservatism, which, by the way, sometimes also contradicts Islam. So, for example, you know, Dr. Rahmatul talked about education being an obligation upon a parent for a male and a female, right? A lot of the time today, you hear Muslims saying women should not be educated because they're going to become Western. That is the wrong solution to the problem. The solution to the problem isn't to go the other way, because when you go to that way, when you adopt what I call a strict conservatism, which is not based on the tradition, not based on Islam, when you adopt that, you actually push young people away from Islam. You push them even further. That is, in fact, what the West want to do. They want to solicit a conservatism which then would even which further divorces people away from Islam, right? Rather, we need to find a counter narrative which is going to be able to explain this onslaught, explain this this globalization and its economic, political, and cultural impacts upon us, but also, inshallah ta'ala, allow us to find a solution, an alternative rooted in the Islamic tradition. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us with that, inshallah ta'ala, and give us the insight and help organizations like the Center for Gender Studies to really build that counter narrative.
Jazakallah khair, Brother Jalal, for the explanations, very crystal clear. And here we have already some questions for the speakers tonight. And I will read the question to open the discussion. The first question comes from Azalia from Indonesia. Salam Brother Jalal from CGS. Salam Brother Jalal. Seeing that many global issues, including feminism, are being forced to be applied in all countries these days, in your opinion, what things that Muslims should or must do to change or challenge the global order, while at the same time, the Muslim countries are still at its weak condition? Thus, when these countries reject those ideas, we are being threatened from economics, political, and even security side. Thank you. Probably we could respond it first.
Yeah, that's a very good question, sister. And what can we do? Well, the first thing we have to do is we have to build a program, a counter narrative, a program to counter this westernization, and a program that's rooted in Islam. And we have to do that forcefully with our intellect and with our ability to explain what Islam is, but also to show the implications of liberalism and its impact upon the Muslim mindset. We're sleepwalking into this because there is no counter narrative, right? Because there is not a way of thinking which contradicts this, and no one is willing to contradict it. By the way, sometimes I find even Islamic speakers, because it's so controversial, they stay away from it. Feminism, if you're anti-feminism, if you produce a good, valuable counter-narrative to feminism, the implication is that you're against modernity. And if you're against modernity, that's a big problem, right? And so a lot of Islamic scholars decide, let's not go there. Let's avoid that question. Well, avoiding it isn't going to make it go away, but also avoiding it is actually against your responsibility as a Muslim. Your responsibility is to make this as part of your da'wah. Now, I don't mean, by the way, that you become so paranoid that you see liberalism in everything, right? Sometimes I come across Muslims in da'wah who over-exaggerate this, but you need to know what the threat is, and you need to be able to challenge it with your mind and challenge it with a narrative, and you need to reach young Muslims. I would say, by the way, that like the program you sisters and brothers hold in Indonesia, there is a need to reach young Muslim minds. I see it here in the West when we hold our courses, the Thinking Muslim courses. I often find young Muslims say, more often than not, 99% of young Muslims we interact with, they say, they don't say to us, what you're saying is foreign, we don't like this. They say to us, why didn't we understand this before? Why didn't we come across this critique of liberalism before and this explanation of Islam? And that's a good thing. That shows me that if the counter narrative is present, inshallah, change will occur.
I hope it answers the question, sister. If you have any feedback or extended question, you can ask it again. So the next question for Brother Jalal again. Assalamualaikum, brother. I would like to extend my question to Brother Jalal. Why do the West, in your opinion, invest a great amount of dollars in sexuality issues in countries like Indonesia? Why does sexuality becomes a very important issue in globalization nowadays? Thank you.
Well, exactly. And this is very interesting. Why is it that gender and sexuality issues have become so dominant? Because, of course, these issues, they have the ability to undermine the Muslim family and the Muslim society quite fundamentally, right, in a very fundamental way. And so, and of course, these issues, if there is a change of attitudes, they break up the moral fiber of a Muslim society. If you think about it, you know, someone once said to me, and I spoke to a brother who wrote a book, a very knowledgeable brother who wrote a book about children, Muslim children, and he said, you know, when Shaitan wants to when Shaitan wants to kill a society, Shaitan starts with the family, because the family is the basic institution in society, which, if it's healthy, it can be the cauldron, the pot, which purifies, right? Even if, by the way, and of course it's reprehensible that our societies are so bad, but even if the societies were so bad, the family is able to cleanse the worst excesses of those societies. But if you destroy those societies, if you destroy those families, if you bring foreign ideas and foreign relations into the families, then you destroy, you devalue those societies. And that's what the colonialists did when they went to Algeria and Morocco and India. They tried to dismantle, to disillusion the Muslim family, right? And I think that's why these issues have become so prominent in Muslim societies. And by the way, as you know full well, these are promoted by Western NGOs, non-governmental organizations, who are paid directly or indirectly by the State Department in America to promote these particular lifestyles. By the way, especially now, you're going to see, now that Biden, the Democrats, are back in power, Donald Trump, he was, of course, a buffoon and wrong bad in so many ways. But Donald Trump decided to stop funding many of these organizations. Of course, Joe Biden has no problems with that, and Joe Biden has now in fact passed an executive order to continue, as part of foreign aid budgets, to continue to fund these socially liberal NGOs in Muslim countries. Don't think that these people are your allies or your friends. Even some Western journalists. I once went to a talk by a very prominent Western journalist from the BBC, and he used to do a lot of reports from the Muslim world. And he said in his talk, because I asked, he was talking about the Middle East a lot, and he said, when I go to a Muslim country, I feel it's my duty to find the liberals and to then focus and make stories about the liberals, right? So even if the liberals in a country were 1%, 5%, he finds it as his duty to make, to extenuate, to exaggerate their call, because he sees it as his obligation, almost his ideological obligation, to raise the profile of these people in our countries, right? And that's why you see the global media is dominated, and the local media is dominated by liberals, people with a liberal mindset, because that's a way to please these Western donors and these Western organizations like the IMF and the World Bank. By the way, the IMF, one last point, the IMF, when it encourages reform in a country, one such reform is social reform. It's not just an economic, it wants to, it's part of its endeavor to change a country. It calls for, the IMF calls for social reform, cultural reform in countries. So you can't divorce the Muslim family from this context, this international context, But also, unfortunately, our governments in Muslim countries, they have, in exchange for some economic growth, they have compromised the Islamic value system of our societies. And you know that full well in your country.
Well, thank you, brother. Probably this will be the last question for me. So actually, this is about the CEDAWs that has been discussed by the first speaker, Sister Rahmatul Husni, which one of the differences between the CEDAW and Islamic perspective on education is that the output of CEDAWs on education is about employment, and how, meanwhile, is in Islam like that, right? So there are questions for Brother Jalal and Sister Urima. First is that how, for Brother Jalal, how this CEDAW's agenda correlates with the liberal capitalism agenda on creating what you say, that economic interdependence in Muslim or women community, how they are called to be emancipated, but actually they are being forced as a new like labor production. And for Sister Rima, how to challenge Muslim community, which nowadays they even has absorbed this kind of thinking mindset or on education is similar with gaining access to employment. Okay, please, probably Sister Rima will answer it first, and then Brother Jalal. See.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. Yeah, actually, this perspective today, that's really our challenge as a women, and also the I heard the speech from Sadhguru from India, I think, yeah, that the measurement or the quality of well-educated men and well-educated women, or we could say the success men, women, measured, measured by the economical system. So that the problem, the problem when it is just about the power of money, well educated, has a higher status, and then have a good financial okay. So what should we do to change this perspective? The first one, of course, is start from ourselves. To begin, I mean, we start. Someone said me that when we change, and then it will change the society, because we could not intervene as one heart. The first one, we should be the role model to change the perspective of the women in the society. And then after that, maybe to build the Professor Dr. Wan Muhammad Wan Daud said that we should build the culture or the society which have the passion for knowledge. He said budaya ilmu. How could we translate it? Budaya ilmu. The society who has passion for knowledge. So when women and the men have this kind of action, and then I think it will have the big impact to the society. Because the society or the collection of the individual or a personal perspective. Okay, I think that's all.
Thank you, Sister Rima, for the answer. That's quite clear, right? And now we are going to hear the answer from Brother Jalal.
Barakallahu feek. Uh, it's a very good question you mentioned. I talked about political globalization and emphasized the IMF and World Bank, but of course the United Nations is also one such political organization, and the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, it's a body to end discrimination against women, which may sound like a benign project, right? It seems like it's a virtuous idea. Of course, everyone will be in favor of ending discrimination against women, but it's not about ending discrimination full stop. It's about what to replace it with. If you were to end discrimination against women, it's like saying we want to end poverty. Capitalism wants to end poverty. Fine, it may want to end poverty, but what does it want to replace it with, right? In the same way, CEDAW is an opportunity to end discrimination by liberalizing those societies, right? Which, by the way, we would say as Muslims, it never ends discrimination against women. So you end discrimination in the home, but you exploit the woman so that the woman no longer obeys the husband but obeys the boss. So the employer now is the one who she has to obey, right? Or you end discrimination against women, fine, and that sounds great, and so you turn her into a consumer, and she spends all of her wealth just consuming because she thinks that's the way to happiness. In the West at the moment, the West have got a very shoddy record, very bad record when it comes to the way they treat young women in particular. We've got the prevalence of, and you may see that in Muslim countries as well, but we've got the prevalence of mental illnesses amongst young women. And the way they treat that is by medicating those illnesses. So there are large numbers of young women. I teach many young women who are on tablets all day. They're on, but they don't think about what are the structural, the social circumstances which have led to that mental health crisis. Is it the type of they sell to young women, the need to embrace an impossible view of beauty, a belief that she can have it all, she's going to be a career woman and have kids, and all of these things, they harm the mindset of young women, and they set unrealistic expectations of young men and women, in fact. So it doesn't stop, creates greater problems for young women as well as young men. But because it is the Hollywood and these cultural outputs constantly show happy people. You don't find, by the way, these happy people in this society. I will tell you for a fact. I walk around on the streets of London. I don't see the types of people you see in Hollywood in London. Neither do I see them. These people. Unfortunately, and we should feel sad about this. These lives are not like that because the reality is much different to what the big screen tells us, right? So I'm afraid the United Nations is part of this project. It's not divorced from the liberal world order. It's part of this project to liberalize the Muslim world. And unfortunately, until we recognize this and no longer work with these organizations and find our own counter to these, we are going to be in this constant cycle of decline, which I'm afraid many of our societies are in. Jazakallah khair for the question, sister.
Sorry, it's muted actually. Thank you for all the answers. Actually, the time is already 10 p.m., but still there are questions. Is it okay to continue the discussion? Okay. So we have the consent from the speaker. So I will continue reading the question. It is from Hani Indira. Assalamualaikum. I would like to ask Brother Jalal, from all the issues caused by globalization, especially the issue about women in this globalization era, from your own opinion, what is the best solution for these issues, on women, these women issues?
So I missed the last. What is the last part of the question?
What is the best solution for these issues, women issues in globalization era?
Right. Okay. So if you mean by women's issues, I think the questioner means the problems women face. Whether those problems come from the globalization, the impact of liberalization, whether that problems come from within our societies, the best solution is Islam, right? You know, our belief is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the Sharia to us, not only because the Sharia is of course the truth, and of course it's the truth, but because it solves problems. The Islamic Sharia solves our problems, and if a Muslim lives by Sharia, then a Muslim is able to solve the very many problems they face. And a good example of that is the responsibilities that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has allocated in his wisdom to the husband and the wife, and the need for those responsibilities to be undertaken. That develops a type of community and a type of society which is at ease with itself, where young people are not living in a perpetual state of sadness because they don't have the attention of either of their parents, right? Here in the UK, the United Kingdom is one of the saddest countries in the world for young people. Yet they consume so much. They have so much wealth, yet they remain extremely sad, to the degree that they have to medicate themselves just to find some happiness, or they have to take drugs, or they have to. Why is there an epidemic of sadness? Part of the problem is because they don't have those human relationships that any family should give them. And that is why, by the way, many non-Muslims, they embrace Islam here in these countries. By the way, you know, I find that many non-Muslims embrace Islam not sometimes because of, you know, of very, very big ideas, very complex ideas, but because they see the Muslim family and the Muslim community, and they say, well, we need that. You know, we're missing that. In fact, there is one last point. There is a journalist here in the West who wrote an article in one of the most right-wing newspapers, the Daily Mail here in the UK. And he said that the reason why Islam is so successful is because Islam has maintained the family and Christianity has lost the family. And as a result, many people see Islam as the marker of success, right? And I would say, you know, my advice is, of course, there are many problems in the Muslim community today, but I would say that if we don't study and live and communicate the virtues of Islam, we're never going to be able to solve these problems. And I would say our governments and our political systems and our politicians should also embrace and reflect these values. And unfortunately, I know from my part of the world in South Asia, that is not the case.
Okay, brother, thank you for the answer. And this will be the following question, quite related with the previous explanation of yours. It is from Siti from SMIT Nuka Abbas Klaten. Salam Brother Jalal, we cannot deny that we are now living in a globalized world with its pros and cons. given the challenges it has in orienting our world, including Islamic world, how we could wisely adjust to it, how to properly embrace, quote unquote, this globalization without losing our identity as Muslim. Thank you.
Well, very good. So yes, but I'm not saying, and by the way, this links very well to a question by, I think, Sister Diva here, which is a very good question. Why is it seems to be a problem when a woman consumes and buy things by something she's earned with her own hustle and hard work? Meanwhile, men all of this time buy luxury cars, $10 million mansions, but doesn't seem to like a threat about hyper consumerism, as you mentioned. You have a very good point. I think the problem is everything. The problem is what you described there, right? We are all, in our own individual ways, we are all a product of this system, and so we reflect the worst excesses of this system, me included, men and women included. I only mentioned for women because, of course, the focus of today's presentation was about Muslim women, and that's only why I mentioned it. But actually, it is a standard across all genders, across men and female. Now, the question about how do we adjust to this world? Well, we adjust to everything. Every culture in the world, we adjust to it from the lens, from the glasses of Islam, right? And so we first ask ourselves, what is the requirements of Islam? And then we take what is acceptable and we reject what is unacceptable. So one needs to approach everything from this perspective. The problem we have in our countries and in Muslim communities is we forget that very basic requirement of Islamic thinking. When we approach any problem, we first ask the question, what is the Hukm Shari'i? What is the legislation from our Creator to see that problem? Now, by the way, Sister Diva's point is it I suppose the implication of the point is that, are you allowed to spend on yourself? Of course you are. Are you allowed to consume? Of course you are. There is no known text in Quran and Hadith which says that if you're not allowed to consume, right? You're not allowed to buy products, even luxury products. Of course you are. That's not the problem. The problem is that when that becomes one-dimensional, when that becomes your life, when your life revolves around that, and you forget about the akhirah, and you forget about your other duties, that is when the problem occurs. So certainly, a Muslim is allowed to earn. A Muslim is allowed to have wealth. A Muslim is allowed to consume, right? We know that Abdurrahman bin Auf, radiallahu anhum, was, in today's language, a millionaire in Medina, right? Very rich, right? Uthman bin Affan, radiallahu anhum, was, of course, a very rich person. But he understood the value of his wealth. He understood what this wealth was given in charity. This wealth was consumed for his family, but this wealth was also given to the Muslim community for the sake of the Islamic call, the Islamic da'wah. And so my point, I suppose, is that we have to filter the modern world through the lens of Islam, not to reject it, not to say it's, but through the lens of Islam. Now that means, for example, give you a practical example. Is it wise for a Muslim parent to give a young male or female, young son or daughter, a mobile phone by which they can access the entire culture of the world every day, every minute of the day, right? Is that a wise decision to make? That's the point I'm making. I'm not saying, by the way, should a child reject technology? Of course, we need technology, right? But you have to then make the decision, is this in line with Islamic tarbiyah? In Islam, we subject a young person to foreign ideas and foreign culture once they have an Islamic understanding, once they have taqwa, right? So the first thing that comes in the tarbiyah of a child, and our sister who came before me would explain this better, I think, than I can. The way to build tarbiyah is first to build taqwa, right? once you have taqwa, then you can deal with the cultures, and you can deal with Hollywood, you can deal with. But if you don't have taqwa and you give a child a mobile phone, you're never going to build taqwa. Actually, taqwa will never be established, because you have got a competitor there, which is a cultural competitor, which is 24 hours. And so what I'm trying to say to you is that, what I'm saying is that a Muslim has to recognize his or her Islamic duties before they embark upon embracing this thing. Our problem today is that we embrace it without any form of consideration for the Islamic truth, for halal and haram. And I think that's where the problem occurs. I hope I'm clear in my answer. Jazakallah khair.
Jazakumullah khairan for all the speakers, for the answer and the great discussion we had tonight. And I think finally we are coming to the end of the session of this international lecture. But before the closing, I would like to hear the closing remarks from all of the speakers tonight, probably starting with Sister Rahmatul Husni and then followed by Brother Jalal. Sister Rima.
Okay, Alhamdulillah for the explanation and also the question. Yeah, so I want to talk about this. Yeah, for our the closing statement. Actually, this is how could the women education is still debatable actually, and yeah, the word put the women as the focus right now, still ongoing. Yeah, and the globalization. Yeah, but the most, but the most, why we are putting only women as the focus? Yeah, Allah has given a different responsibility. Yeah, we have different responsibility for women and men. Yeah. So yeah, the feminist agenda, they want to make male and female equal. And it is not necessary actually to respect the women doing the same thing that a man is doing. A woman should succeed as women, not as a man. Yeah, so and also the one which related, yeah, closely the education nowadays, the value of success should not be measured in terms of economic, and also don't think that the men have no, I mean, not be exploited in the world. Actually, injustice happens to men and women. However, in Indonesia, we just have a Menteri Pemberdayaan Wanita, yeah, and women's gender equality just concerned on women's problem. Actually, men have so many problems also. They got exploitation also, yeah, even by the wife. Yeah, there are so many cases about it. Okay, so I think that's all. Well-educated men, well-educated women actually should be based on Islamic perspective, not based on CEDAW, because the concepts are really different. Thank you very much. Jazakumullah khairan.
Thank you, Sister Rahmatul Husni, our well-educated women based on Islamic perspective, and also CEDAW's perspective. And now we are hearing the closing remarks from Brother Jalal. The time is yours, brother.
Barakallahu feekum. Jazakallah khair, Sister Rahmatul, for your very good answers, and Jazakallah khair for inviting me today. And alhamdulillah, I've enjoyed it, and I've enjoyed the questions you have asked today in today's session. Look, I think maybe my final remarks is we have to, and it's really down to Muslims who have the luxury to think. Some of us, we have the luxury to think because maybe, you know, we are a little bit more better off than, you know, the vast majority of Muslims today who live in poverty, they live in migration, they're migrants, they live as refugees. You know, the Muslim world is in a very bad state. But we as educated Muslims have a little bit more time to think. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will account us for the way we use our minds and the way we express ourselves and the way we communicate, the time we spend and our ability to influence other Muslims. So my advice to, you know, to everyone who has watched and listened to today's presentations, you know, get involved with these projects like the Center for Gender Studies, and try to develop counter narratives and counter understanding to these dominant norms, these dominant ideas that are now taken for granted by Muslim communities. And we have to do this, because not only because it is hard, but also because it is our Islamic duty, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will question us about how we use our time and our energy and our abilities. So I will, you know, remind you and remind myself that, you know, this is a very important responsibility, and we need to reorient our societies on the basis of Islamic thinking, westernization, or to this liberalization. Jazakallah khair for all your attention today, and please forgive me if I did not explain myself very well today, but may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you for your great activity. Barakallah feek.
Amen. Okay. Finally, it is the final, the end of today's lecture. I would like to again thank you for our speakers, the time and beneficial knowledge given for us tonight. And I would also thank the audiences who are very actively participate in this lecture. I hope we can enjoy from this meeting, and I do apologize if I have made mistakes during the lecture. Finally, us in realizing what we have learned today, how to realizing Islamic values for the Muslim and others who are who want to accept the values and the light of Islam. So this all the an international lecture series on women, on Muslim women and globalization by Center for Gender Studies Indonesia. I hope we can meet again in the next international lecture, and for keeping update with our agendas, events, and writings and stuff, you can follow our social media, and you can also follow or hear the podcast by Brother Jalal from the Thinking Muslim. Also, thank you again, once again, for the speakers, for the audiences for tonight international lecture. So for us, wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Walaikum salam.